So in this video, we're going to be looking at using the quadratic formula. So once again, completing the square, factoring, all of those methods are essentially doing the same thing, which is solving a quadratic equation. That's exactly what the quadratic formula does. So the biggest challenge you're going to have is actually memorizing the quadratic formula. Now, before we do that, let's just first get some steps down. So the first thing we want to do is have our quadratic in standard form, which looks like this. And I won't even write it out. I'll just write the formula. So ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0. So essentially, we want everything equal to 0, okay, just like factoring. Now, what we're going to do for our second step is actually find a, b, and c, and then we're just going to substitute those values into the quadratic formula. And once we do that, really we just have to simplify for step 3 and we're finished. So once we simplify, we're pretty much good to go. So now this is the challenging part for some people. And I'll give you a suggestion of how you can memorize it after I write it down. So first, x equals negative b plus or minus radical, which is just a square root. And inside of that radical is b squared minus 4ac, and then everything on the right side is all over 2a. Now, this is going to be really corny, but there is a song, well, several songs that you can find on YouTube. Unfortunately for you, I'm not going to be singing it today, but you can find several songs on YouTube. You can just literally type in quadratic, and I guarantee you when you start typing QUAD, it's going to pull up quadratic formula song. So what I would do if you're having a challenging time with this formula and memorizing it, just go find a song and literally sing it to yourself. Sometimes I have to sing it to myself just to memorize it in case I forget it. All right, but this is the most important part of this because most of us are able to substitute in variables all day long. So this is going to be the major point that you have to memorize, which is the actual formula itself. So let's look at a problem just to see how this works. So let's say we have x squared plus 2x minus 63 equals 0. Now, we could actually try to factor this, but let's just act like we didn't want to factor this. Or maybe we're having an off day and we just don't even realize to factor this. We're going to use the quadratic formula. So the first thing we want to do is identify a, b, and c. So a here is always in front of x squared, which would be 1. B is going to be in front of x, which it would be 2. And then c is going to be in, well, basically at the end with no variable, and that would be negative 63. All right, so we're going to take all of that and we're going to plug it into our quadratic formula. So we're going to say x equals negative b, so negative b would be negative 2, plus or minus the square root, and inside of that square root, we're going to have a couple different things. We're going to have b squared, so 2 squared, minus 4 times a, which would be 1, and then times c, which is negative 63. And then all of that on the right side is all over 2a, so it would be 2 times 1. So now, our job from here is basically to just simplify. The simplifying can be done a couple different ways. I mean, if you're good with a calculator, you can plug it into a calculator. I'm just going to do it the long way so you can see it. First, we need to figure out what's going to be inside of this radical. So the first thing I would do is 2 squared, which is 4, minus, then we're going to do 4 times negative 63, which is actually going to give us plus 252. And then all of that's over 2. Now, a mistake you can make is to try to just simply cancel these. Here's why we can't cancel these 2's here. It's because this plus or minus essentially blocks that from happening. Now, in a second or at the end, we might be able to do something with it, but right now we can't. All right, so let's clear this just so I can have some room. So x equals negative 2 plus or minus the square root. We have 4 plus 252 all over 2. All right, so now we're going to continue with what's inside of our radical. We're going to do 4 plus 252. So that would give me x equals negative 2 plus or minus the square root of 256 all over 2. And hopefully we're good with this, but the square root of 256 is actually just 16. So this becomes 16. So now we have x equals negative 2 plus or minus 16 all over 2. Now, once you get here, it's a tendency or a common mistake for people to just say, well, I'm finished. However, we're not finished because negative 2 and 16 are like terms. I could add those two together and subtract those two. So this plus or minus actually breaks down into two cases. And here's what it gives me. It gives me negative 2 plus 16 over 2. That's one case. The second case is negative 2 minus 16 over 2. So let's see, that would give me, this first case would give me 14 over 2, which is going to equal, let's see, that would give me 7. So 7 is one of my x values. And this other case would give me, let's see, negative 18 over 2. So my other x value would be negative 9. So let me get rid of some of this just so we have room. All right, so now we can say x equals positive 7, negative 9, and that is my two, or those are my two x values. All right, so let's look at a harder example, because here's the thing about the quadratic formula. If you're really good at factoring, I would factor before I did the quadratic formula, but let's say that you run into a situation where you can't factor. Like, let's say we have x squared minus 9 equals 4x. All right, so if we have this set up, first thing we want to do is we want to say, okay, we're using the quadratic formula, so we want everything equal to 0. So that means this minus 4x or positive 4x, we're going to subtract it to move it to the left. So x squared minus 4x minus 9 equals 0. Now, in this problem, we actually can't even factor this if we wanted to. I guess we could maybe go through a process of trying to complete the square. We have different methods, but the method we're going to use is the quadratic formula. So once again, we want to identify a, b, and c. So a here is 1, b is negative 4, and c is negative 9. So we're going to take all of that and plug it into the actual formula. So x is going to equal negative b. Now, b is negative 4, so when I do negative b, it's actually a negative times a negative 4, which is actually going to make this positive 4. So it would become 4 plus or minus the square root of b squared, which would be negative 4 squared, minus 4ac. And a would be 1, c would be negative 9. And then we're going to divide everything on the right by 2a, which would still just be 2 because 2 times 1 is 2. All right, so now we're going to actually start our simplifying. But that's how we set it up. So let's rewrite this just so I have room. All right, so now if we have, which I'll just rewrite the whole thing. It'll be fine. What do we say? 4 times 1 times negative 9. And then it's all over 2. All right. So the first thing I want to do if I want to simplify this on the inside is I want to make sure that I just get everything inside the radical dealt with before I move on. So I would square negative 4 first. That would give me 16. Negative, this would be negative 4 times 1 times negative 9. So it would create plus 36. And then it's all over 2. Once again, a common mistake here is for people to, they'll try to divide these. But right now we can't. In a second we'll be able to, but for right now we can't really do that yet. So x equals 4 plus or minus the square root, and that would give me 52 all over 2. All right, so now here's what I would do if I were you. I want to break down this radical because obviously the square root of 52 doesn't give me a whole number as an answer. So what I would do, I would bring this to the side and just break down this radical, or you could even do it on like a separate sheet of paper. So the square root of 52, let's see, I can divide 52. The biggest perfect square that divides it would be 4. And that would give me 4 times 13. So then this would become the square root of 4, which is actually 2 radical 13. All right, so now here's what we actually have. Let's make ourselves some room. X equals 4 plus or minus 2 radical 13 all over 2. Now, this is where we can divide this 2 now, because even though this says plus or minus, here's what this basically looks like when we break the denominator apart into 2 separate denominators. We have 4 over 2 plus or minus 2 radical 13 over 2. So what I can actually do here is I can say 4 over 2 is just 2, so x equals 2 plus or minus, and then 2 over 2 gives me 1, so it would just be 1 radical 13, which is just radical 13. So there's our answer. All right. Now, let's do one more just so you can see an example when you have an imaginary number that's actually left in your answer. So we're going to do negative 3x squared plus 8x minus 7 equals 0. So now, you could do a couple different methods here. If it were me, I probably would only try the quadratic formula here, but that's what this whole video is about. So let's just do the quadratic formula. So the first thing we want is everything equal to 0. That's fine. Now we want to identify a, b, and c. A is equal to negative 3, b is 8, and c is negative 7. So now we're going to plug that into the actual quadratic formula. So x equals negative b, so that would give me negative 8, plus or minus the square root of b squared, so 8 squared, minus 4 times a, which is negative 3, times c, which is negative 7, all over 2a, so 2 times negative 3. So this one actually has a lot more going on than previous problems, but still, if you can memorize the actual quadratic formula, the rest of this is just simplifying. So negative 8 plus or minus, we're going to end up with, let's see, 64. There's 3 negatives here, so this would actually stay minus. 4 times 3 times 7 would give me 84. And it's all over 2 times negative 3, which is negative 6. So here's what we've got. We've got negative 8 plus or minus the square root of 64 minus 84 over negative 6. So let's make ourselves some room. X equals negative 8 plus or minus, we said it was 64 minus 84, I believe, yeah, all over negative 6. Once again, a tendency here is to try to deal with this negative 8, negative 6, but don't do that just yet. You want to make sure you get this radical completely simplified before you do that. So this radical is going to end up giving me the square root of negative 20. Now, what I want to do is I want to break down this radical first, then I can rewrite it. And hopefully you're noticing this radical has a negative under it, so I can take out the negative and replace it with I. Then I can break down what's in the radical. So 20 would break down and give me the square root of 4 times the square root of 5. So this would be 2i radical 5. So now here's what we have. X equals negative 8 plus or minus 2i radical 5 over negative 6. So now, here's what we can do with this. We can once again break this apart so that this is negative 8 over negative 6 plus or minus 2i radical 5 over negative 6. Now, this negative is already accounted for with this plus or minus, so I can actually just make this a positive. It doesn't really matter the sign for this one. Because this plus or minus is alternating and it accounts for positive and negative, there's no way this negative 6 is going to mess anything up. So let's see. X is going to equal negative 8 over negative 6 would give me positive 4 over 3 plus or minus. Let's see. 2 over 6 would give me 1 over 3. So it would give me I radical 5 over 3. Now, if these two have the same denominator, you'll probably see it rewritten like this. And I'll rewrite the whole thing just so you can see it. We just said x equals 4 over 3 plus or minus I radical 5 over 3. If these two fractions have the same denominator, most likely you'll see the answer written over one denominator. So you can take 4 plus or minus I radical 5 and write that all over 3. That's most likely how you'll see your answer. Now, once again, the biggest idea behind the quadratic formula is the memorization of the quadratic formula. So that's your main goal. Then the simplifying can be a little challenging, but as you work through this, it gets easier. So reach out, or I guess you can leave a comment or anything like that if you have any questions. But that will be it for this video, and that's the quadratic formula.